Thank you, everybody, for coming. Glad to see all 75 plus of you joining the event today. I'd like to thank David for hosting the event and organizing to have it uploaded, a recording uploaded to YouTube afterwards. And since I'm doing thank yous, I'm going to thank my student Amoga Gorer for the flyer and organizing many other things,
What
sending
I'll
it.
frame my video? I don't know.
And somebody might want to mute themselves. So the idea for this event, other than Gene passing away, was that I participated in something
They're not
similar.
there anymore.
Uh,
Mm,
let's see if who could, yeah, mute. So I participated in something similar about a year ago, where the life of another
oh, so
outstanding academic was celebrated in an event that David organized, that one being Professor Christopher Hood, who taught at Oxford after teaching for a period of time here at LSE, and it was a very moving occasion. I was really interested in seeing the experience that others had had, the influence that Hood had on them. And so, and also in a kind of an outcome is everybody who had had some contact with him sort of felt closer to each other, which is, I think, stayed with us. So I wanted to have the same thing happen for Gene and his friends and his academic community, and not least because he influenced me so much. So we have some speakers who are going to be sharing some thoughts, and then it will be open to anybody who would like to talk to us about their experience and reflections. But before we get started, I thought it would be a good idea to welcome Nancy Bardach, Jean's wife, and maybe introduce the rest of her family, and if she'd like, say anything about today's occasion.
My first career was raising my children, and it was for Gene too. It was an incredibly important part of his life. They consist of three girls. Elizabeth Lawrence is the oldest. She is a biologist in Pittsburgh. With her lives there with her family. Jeffrey Lawrence, another biologist, and her daughter Gia. Rebecca Bardach, my middle daughter, is smiling at us right now, is living in Jerusalem and writing a book right now about the shared society idea in Israel, trying to have Arabs and Jews live in a shared society there. My youngest daughter, Naomi, who is a pediatrician and researcher at UCSF, is lives in San Francisco, lives nearby, and her family, they all have family. I have six grandchildren and three wonderful sons-in-law, and they all miss Jean enormously. Okay.
Thank you very much. Okay, so I've got a kind of running order of people who have agreed to speak today, and I'm going to just start with Bob Kagan to share his thoughts, and we'll move on after that. Bob?
Um, I'm so glad that, well, first of all, I was trying to thank you, Michael, and thank you, David, for organizing this and inviting me. And uh, and I'm so glad that Nancy and Elizabeth and Rebecca and Naomi are with us. Um, this is a painful and difficult subject for me. Gene Bardach was my colleague at Berkeley for 40 years, and he was a dear and very close friend. I loved him, and I admired him in so many ways that I feel that no matter what I say today, it's like I can't do him justice. But I have to start somewhere. So I decided to go back to the beginning of our relationship in the late 1970s when we started a field research project on regulatory enforcement and wrote Going by the Book. So I wrote out my remarks so that I don't keep going too long. There's hardly a paragraph in that book that was not a joint creation, but I'm sure that all the passages of elegant writing in that book were Gene's alone. And one thing I would like to do today is to read you a couple of those paragraphs, those passages, because they highlight some key things about Gene's mind and mode of thought. Listen to the very first paragraph of Going by the Book. Very first sentence. The rule of law was invented to restrain the willfulness of kings and nobles. In modern republican states, it is invoked by citizens to restrain all manner of public institutions, but the restraints of the rule of law are willful in their own way. They dictate that all statutes and regulations be applied uniformly, consistently. The realm of human activity in which these rules are applied, however, is diverse and complex. It is not always possible to successfully connect the requirements of law to the variety of experience. Yet government must govern, and if it cannot do so by forging perfect connections to the society it governs, then it will make do with imperfect connections. Uniform regulations, even those that are justifiable in the general run of cases, inevitably appear to be unreasonable in many particular cases. Once you read that, if you absorb that, you don't need the rest of the book. I mean, that really sums it up beautifully. And I remember marveling at that opening sentence. The rule of law was invented to restrain the willfulness of kings and nobles. I read that at first in the draft. I said, wow. I thought what that sentence does is expands the scope of the book. It underscores the stakes of the issue that it addressed. It tells us that a book about the mundane subject of regulatory enforcement is also necessarily a book about the rule of law and the restraint of power. That's a topic we can hardly ignore nowadays. And just about the only break we have on a presidential bulldozer trying to destroy the administrative state is the rule of law and some brave lower court judges. That sentence also reminds me that Gene was steeped in political philosophy, in that he read sociology and economics and great literature, and that he habitually and naturally and unpretentiously drew upon all that knowledge all the time to extend everyone's field of vision addressing any issue. Here's a mundane example. I was in a movie club with Gene and his wife Nancy and three other couples. And Nancy, it's still going, right? Yeah, and I saw Stuart is here. Each month, we all watched at home a movie selected by one of the couples, and then we met and took turns saying what we thought about the movie of the month. Then it would be Gene's turn, and he'd always say something to me, I think to all of us, that was surprising. An insight that placed the film in some larger historical or social or political context. That's exactly what he would do with public policy problems. He'd extend the field of vision. Gene would sort of open your eyes wider. And then there's the last sentence in that paragraph. Uniform regulations, even those that are justifiable in the general run of cases, inevitably appear to be unreasonable in many particular cases. That's the main topic of the book. Regulatory unreasonableness and its main insight in recognizing and emphasizing the inevitability of regulatory unreasonableness was Gene's lasting contribution to the study of regulation. For regulated business people, regulatory unreasonableness is deeply annoying, and so regulation is deeply annoying. And that has huge implications for the politics of regulation. And here's one more paragraph on that subject. One last thing I'll read to you. It's, again, a wonderful piece of writing. Everyone who has ever been subjected to regulation, whether at the hands of a welfare eligibility evaluator, an affirmative action compliance specialist, or a county sanitation officer, has a stock of horror stories about particular regulatory encounters. These stories enter into the stream of conversation and ultimately into the cultural consciousness that defines and measures the evils of regulation. Horror stories may not represent the modal pattern of regulatory agency activity and may in fact mask the good that is achieved, but they do reflect a general truth about the vexatiousness of regulatory unreasonableness. That is just a gem of a bit of writing of sociological analysis. And it makes a vital point about one stream of anti-regulation politics. And, and his focus on horror stories reflects Gene's ability to regulate the importance of phenomena that others might dismiss. One more point I want to make. I would have been content in writing, going by the book, with a book that described regulatory unreasonableness and explained why it occurs. That's normal social science. But Gene was a political scientist who had also become a public policy analyst. He was dedicated to policy solutions. He was a problem solver, and he was relentlessly persistent in that regard. One characteristic of Gene that always amazed me, he would keep thinking about a problem long after I was ready to settle for a plausible solution. I would think a conversation had ended. But no, he kept thinking and pushing it harder and harder and came up with more. So he made the purpose of going by the book to explore how regulatory unreasonableness might be minimized. Gene was both an idealist and a pragmatist, and this arose from his nature. He was a man in full, a man of intelligence and the feeling, a man of books, and a man who was compulsively interested in how the world worked, a man of principle, and a man of extraordinary warmth and capacity for friendship. I can't begin to tell you how much I miss him. Thanks.
Thank you very, very much. On my list, Dave Weimer, I think you're attending, and if you are, I can't see you with my vision here, but
Yes.
could you share your thoughts?
Yes. Gene co-taught my introductory course in policy analysis in the spring of 1974. The following year, he went to the Department of the Interior. So I didn't really get to know him well, and I didn't have the benefit of his wisdom when I was designing my dissertation. But sometime after I left GSPP, I became friends with Gene, and he became one of my mentors. And it's not hard to understand why Gene becomes a friend for so many of us. In addition to being smart and interesting, he also had a good sense of humor and treated people well, irrespective of their status, characteristics that I think make for a very good friend. I actually expected to go, being a W, I actually expected to go last. So rather than talking about some of the work that was more directly influential to me, I want to talk about his first two books. Most of you policy scholars will be familiar with the implementation game. My guess is fewer have read his book, The Skill Factor in Politics. And let me begin by saying, at the risk of overgeneralizing, disciplinary scholars tend to take their problems from the literature and then turn to the world for empirical tests. Whereas I think policy scholars tend to take their problems from the world and then turn to the literature to broaden their interpretation. And I believe this characterizes Gene's, maybe his work all through his career, but it certainly set him out as a pioneering policy scholar, in my view. The other thing I would say, and Bob has already brought this to our attention, is that Gene cared about making the world better. He was a scholar, but he also wanted to help us make the world better. And I think something like telling us about how to do scenario writing in the implementation game is an example of that. Practical things the rest of us could do to try to adopt policies to make the world better. Despite several moves and downsizing of my library, I kept his skill factor in politics. And I remembered it primarily as a book about major change in mental health laws in California. But when I looked at it, I realized almost all of my highlighting was in the third part of the book, which was on entrepreneurship. And you get a sense of this from the chapter titles of those last four thoughts on entrepreneurship. The entrepreneur designs a proposal and seeks support. The entrepreneur builds a coalition. The entrepreneur meets an opposition. And then he talked about the essential entrepreneur. In this, Gene was already anticipating the role of analysis as a resource for political entrepreneurs. He identified basic analysis, which he saw as assessing existing problems and proposing alternatives, what he called corrective analysis, that is modifying proposals to deal with criticisms to build greater support. And he also proposed the idea of reintegrative analysis. And to my disappointment, he has a footnote that says, well, I didn't see any examples of this in my research, but it was thoughtful nevertheless. He turns to one of his characters in the political skill factor, Assemblyman Frank Lanterman, as an exemplar of what he later calls in the second book, the book on implementation, a fixer. The importance of having somebody involved in the implementation who will step in and help deal with the problems that have arisen. As I said, I could talk a lot more about his later work that influenced me directly, but just thinking back on these early works, how innovative he was, how thoughtful he was in his interpretation. And you can see the drive to understanding how we can make the world better. So I'm sure I share the thought with all of you that we will miss Gene very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dave. Dorothy, do you want to share your thoughts?
Good. Thank you. What an honor to be in this who's who in public policy group. And I'm dying to know more from Dave about the book Dog Economics on his shelf. I met Eugene Bardach in September 1976, 50 years ago, when I arrived at Goldman as a first-year MPP student. Gene and a wonderful economist named Frank Levy taught Introduction to Policy Analysis, or IPA, where we learned to navigate the Eightfold Path. By my calculation, we were only the third MPP class Gene had taught. In addition to IPA, he taught a section of the Advanced Policy Analysis course, in which second-year students carried out their thesis equivalent project known as an APA. My classmates and I loved our 2 years at Goldman by and large, and Gene was a very, very significant reason for that. I also stayed on to do a PhD. Gene was my dissertation advisor, career mentor, but I'm going to focus today on the MPP experience. Based on conversations that I've had with classmates since Gene died, as well as at a 40th reunion that my class held in 2018, I want to highlight 3 reasons Gene had such an outsized impact on our careers and our lives. First, Gene's preferred approach to teaching was to connect students to clients who wanted help with real public policy problems. Typical clients included the City of Oakland, the Berkeley Mayor, the California Public Utility Commission. We worked in teams of 3 for our first year IPA project before flying solo for our second year APA. Having identified the clients, which is no small task, Gene and Frank helped us navigate a policy analysis process that was challenging at many, many levels. Gene was proud of having coached more than 500 projects while at Goldman, field projects, and an incident at my class's 40th reunion drove that home. When I saw my old classmate, Buzz Breedlove, for the first time in decades, I mentioned my favorite memory of Buzz. His first year IPA project was a quantitative analysis of Oakland's sewer service rates. Buzz and his teammates dedicated their final report to Ed Norton, the New York City sewer worker portrayed by Art Carney on The Honeymooners, and one of the greatest TV characters of all time. I never forgot that. Coincidentally, Gene walked by, joined Buzz and me in our conversation, and when he realized we were discussing Buzz's 42-year-old IPA project, to my amazement, Gene launched into a summary of the core analytic issue, whether sewer service charges should better reflect the higher cost to serve residents in the Oakland Hills as well as their higher incomes. He also told me why the analysis that Buzz and his teammates did was so trenchant. Every Goldman alum I know can recall their IPA and APA projects in detail, which is a clear sign of their pedagogic power. Little did I realize that Eugene Bardach could remember the projects in detail as well. The second reason Gene had such an outsized impact was that his classroom teaching reinforced the input he provided as a project coach. He urged us to spend more time thinking, less time trying to gather yet more data. He was an intellectual curmudgeon, scratching his head, posing question after question after question to challenge whatever comfortable assumptions we had made. He urged us to avoid the rhetoric surrounding prominent issues like homelessness, rent control, and fuel efficiency. His skepticism was consistent with powerful ideas we were learning in our economics course, opportunity costs, unintended consequences. But Gene brought his own slant based on some deeper understanding of the many roadblocks to good public policy as economists defined it. Gene tempered our excitement about shiny new policy solutions with the dreaded question, if this is such a good idea, why isn't someone already doing it? Third, Gene had an outsized impact because he modeled the values he sought to instill in us. As one of my classmates put it, I so admired Gene as a professor and as a person. In truth, the 2 roles were inseparable for Gene. His teaching style was parental. He used parables to drive home important life lessons, such as the one about the foolish man in a butcher shop obsessing over which rabbit to buy for his horse and rabbit stew, the point being that the delicate flavor of rabbit would be overwhelmed by the strong taste of horse meat. Gene was interested in students as individuals and attuned to the dynamics of project teams and individual classes. The class that preceded ours had a disgruntled member who had soured some of his classmates. I was struck by how much that dynamic had affected Gene that year, first year. Gene and Nancy often hosted students for dinner, and Gene offered our class the use of his house and yard for our reunion. For me, Gene's defining quality as a person and a professor was his unerring moral compass. He brought immense integrity to everything he did. When I gave a talk at Goldman while I was working in the Clinton White House, I characterized our economic policies as being pro-market and pro-business. Gene let me know he thought it was inappropriate to tout being pro-business. When I had dinner with Gene and Nancy last summer here in DC, we talked of little else but family and President Trump's jaw-dropping deeds. Several months later, Gene sent me his powerfully cathartic Declaration of Independence, second edition, the last email I had from him. I despair daily that our institutions and norms may never recover. But if they do, it will be in part because thousands of students, practitioners, readers, clients have learned right from wrong and so much more. From Eugene Bardach.
Thank you so much. Dorothy, Eric?
Yes, thank you so much, Michael and David, for organizing this. So, as everyone knows, Gene was one of the most creative and influential policy scholars of his generation. I was incredibly fortunate to be a student at Berkeley's Goldman School. I met Gene in 1987 when I was just 22, a first year MPP student fresh out of college, and like Gene, raised in Baltimore. In the nearly 40 years that Gene was in my life, I learned so much from him, not only about how to study public policy, but how to be both a productive researcher and a dedicated teacher, how to draw on insights from many different disciplines while keeping one's own scholarly voice, and most importantly, how to balance professional commitments and family life while maintaining a sense of humor. After my own dad, no man has had a greater impact on my life than Gene. So let me say a few words about Gene's scholarship and then share a couple of personal recollections. Gene was trained as a political scientist, but he was an unusually broad thinker. He cared about good ideas to make government work better, no matter their origin. And so he read exceptionally widely in economics and psychology and sociology, even in evolutionary biology. The big topics that dominate the modern political science discipline, elections, parties, public opinion, never quite held him. What he was most interested in is what you might call the micropolitics of governance, the official trying to implement a policy, the regulatory inspector at the factory gate, the network of agencies trying to share clients without waging turf battles, the public manager trying to figure out whether a program that worked well in another town might work also in hers. And Gene's work bridged academic theory and on-the-ground practice with rare facility. He was optimistic about using smart practices to improve government performance, but realistic about the political and institutional obstacles in the way. And throughout his career, he returned again and again to a single hopeful conviction that political resources, above all, political entrepreneurship, as Dave Weimer mentioned, and the insight gained through policy analysis could be deployed to navigate the American political system and actually solve problems. This theme, I think, really runs through all of his books, The Skill Factor in Politics, which was mentioned. I'll just talk for a moment about his second book, which had a large impact on me, The Implementation Game, which came out in 1977, a moment of growing disappointment that some well-intentioned Great Society programs had not achieved their goals. Gene reframed implementation as a set of games played by parties pursuing their own ends in an unfolding strategic context. Games all too familiar to advocates who watch their victories fail to deliver after enactment. Diversion of resources, massive resistance, and of course, is the favorite game of blame avoiding actors, not our problem. Crucially, Gene argued that planners can anticipate these games by writing implementation scenarios that walk through how a policy will actually unfold and be exploited. And he drew attention to the indispensable role of what he called fixers, actors who, when things go wrong, step in to repair a policy and build a more conducive environment to make the policy work. Gene's insight that the real test of a program is whether it can survive the implementation process has rarely felt more vindicated than the past several years, when historic legislation and infrastructure and semiconductors and EV chargers and broadband ran into precisely the kind of delays and frictions that he taught us to anticipate. And the fixes Gene wrote about have been in short supply, with precisely the consequences for government performance that his scholarship predicted. Now, if those books and many others made his reputation as a scholar, it was the Eightfold Path book, A Practical Guide for Policy Analysis, that has made his insights an indispensable presence in policy school classrooms. The book has been translated into multiple languages. It's been adopted in graduate and undergraduate programs around the world. And it distills what Gene had learned as a teacher at the Goldman School, coaching so many of those projects. The steps of the Eightfold Path seem pretty simple: defining problems, assembling evidence, and so on. But what made the book endure is that Gene filled those steps with practical insights on how to think clearly and creatively about hard problems. About 15 years ago, Gene gave me a very unexpected gift. He invited me to co-author subsequent editions of the Eightfold Path book with him, and we did three editions together. Before he passed, Gene sent me many suggestions and edits for the next edition, which I'll be working on this coming academic year, which is an incredible honor for me. So I'm pleased to keep the Eightfold Path franchise going, but I think ultimately Gene's enduring legacy doesn't lie in any one publication or even in any single concept or finding. It's really in the sensibility he transmitted to generation of practitioners, the belief that we can move the world a few inches toward where it ought to be. And most of all, Gene taught us that public policy is about asking good questions. What is the problem we're trying to solve? Is there another way to define that problem, one that leaves more room for fresh thinking? And if our preferred solution isn't feasible, what's second best? For me, Gene was not just a mentor and a co-author. He was a treasured friend, a constant source of support and wisdom, and he was always willing to help. No matter how busy he always was willing to lend a helping hand. Back in the mid-2000s, when I was teaching at the University of Virginia, the provost asked me to work with him on the design and launch of a new public policy school. It was a challenging assignment. There was opposition from some key stakeholders, many practical hurdles to overcome. Gene generously spent a week in Charlottesville, interviewed all the key faculty and administrators, and wrote an excellent consultant's report that helped get the Batten School off to a great start. Gene had so many endearing qualities: his boundless curiosity about new ideas, his intellectual playfulness, his warmth and generosity, his wonderful sense of humor. He was incredibly wise, but he wasn't all-knowing. He didn't, for example, always keep up with the latest fads in popular culture. I remember one time driving around with him in Berkeley, and he turned to me and said, "What is going on with all these pilates places popping up? Everywhere I look, there's pilates, pilates, pilates. Every corner they're there." I said, "What gives?" he said. I had absolutely no idea what he was talking about. And then it hit me. He meant Pilates studios. So Gene and I were constant email companions. We would write each other about something in the news or share thoughts about books or blogs we read. There have been so many times in the past few weeks since Gene's passing when I've come across something and I immediately thought, what would Gene think? I have to send this to him. And I wanted to know his views. I will miss Gene deeply, and I feel so lucky to have had the chance to learn from him, to write with him, and to be his friend.
Thank you. That's wonderful, Eric. Craig, it's a good time.
Yeah, I'm just so pleased to be here and honored. I arrived at what is now the Goldman School about the time that Eric Patashnik arrived. So I had his 1980s influence. And as we've heard from everybody, his intellectual contributions continued over time into different areas. And when I was writing up my notes for this, I think of him as one of the founders of what would become known as public management, which I think of as addition to and corrective to public administration, the focus on organizational systems, how we think about what individuals do who are morally guided to think about what we call public values now, all the different values we should consider and how the individual should be involved in that. And he was an advisor from the very beginning. I mean, he really shaped me. He recruited me to come, and I came as a policy analyst. I really thought I'm going to be this data guy who comes up with really good ideas, use what we now know as the Eightfold Path. And I shifted while I was there gradually, and I became very interested in policy implementation. But I didn't quite follow Gene because I was really interested in organizational systems. But he was always reminding me the individual matters and kept on telling me, Craig, let's talk about individuals. And I was all about organizational systems. But so in that way, he didn't really shift me, but he had really big impacts. My other favorite teacher at the Goldman School was Lee Friedman. I was super inspired by him. I thought I'm going to go get my PhD in economics, and I can still hear exactly what he said to me. 3 times he repeated my name. He said, Craig, Craig, Craig. Why would you want to do that? Economics has no new ideas. And I thought, that's interesting. I'd been a TA in economics and I ended up going to political science. But he continued to have a lot of influence on me, both while I was getting my MPP degree. And a funny story, what I thought was really funny at the time, I had a team doing the IPA, the Introduction to Policy Analysis in the first year. Our team collected a lot of data. And we thought we were so clever. We developed this matrix for analysis, and Gene gave us the feedback, and he looked at it. And again, if the words I can remember so clearly, he said, watch out for the tyranny of the matrix. And we thought at the time, this is really funny. The tyranny of the matrix. And only over time did I really understand what he was talking about. We were so proud of the ability to take so much information and array it in a particular way into a matrix for analysis. And he thought that was too much. We're losing the story and we shouldn't be advising just upon the tyranny of the matrix. And this was the end of my first year when I really realized I wasn't a data analysis. I wanted to understand how things worked, and gradually shifted towards policy implementation and learned about his book, The Fixer. And the way I think about Gene and what I began to study is I think about his work in terms of the metaphor of architecture, how you build things, how the individual builds things. And so you see it later in his book, Getting Agencies to Work Together, the idea of building collaborative capacity. And Eric harked back to the idea of the fixer in his first book, The Implementation Game. And so the idea that there are people out there who repair things, people out there who build things. It's this micro level, morally driven focus on what public managers do and what they should do. And to me, that was all very interesting and important, but I remained my focus on organizational systems and went to political science and focused on policy process and public administration. But over time, Gene and I reconnected. I mean, I'd been his research assistant for a while, but intellectually, we're kind of on different paths. And we both ended up studying interagency collaboration, discovered that later, and what became now known as collaborative governance, which was my whole career. And I was very fortunate to have him join my dissertation. A foil is not the right term, but he kept on pushing me to get individuals into the story, which I did to some extent, to think more about individual strategy, which I resisted for a long time. But it was great to have somebody who was really pushing me to think about things that I was kind of forgetting about. And, this was the period in which he was preparing his book, 1998, getting agencies to work together. And I was focused on incentives to collaborate. I was thinking about how organizational incentives and systems level incentives were getting agencies to collaborate. Yes, individuals are doing the collaboration through networks and problem solving, but I kept my focus at that organizational systems level. And one of the things he would push back on me, he would say, again, Craig, he would often start with my name, and that's when it would catch my attention. He would say, Craig, you're being too theoretical. But that was what driving me. I wanted to see the patterns and explain the patterns. And he would say, you're being too theoretical, break it down. Let's talk about individuals and what they do. He was a big fan at the time of Mark Moore's book, Creating Public Value, the manager who's using morally driven arguments to create something. It goes back to the way I think about Gene in terms of how you think about individuals building capacity to do things better and having it morally driven on a wider set of criteria than just efficiency or even just effectiveness, because effectiveness requires you to think about particular goals. But I think he was thinking much more broadly. Um, and, to me, Gene was a great mentor. And I only realized, like many of us probably, the impact he had on our lives. And if he hadn't said, Craig, economics has no new ideas, I might have ended up going into economics and not being happy. And, he really, as a mentor, I can see later how he shifted my perspective, but not completely. But that was great. And so I look back to him as well as a founder of the field of public management, what we call it today, public management, thinking about what individuals are doing to manage in the public sector, and not just the systems that have been created for them to work within. So that's my relatively short tribute to Gene. And I'm very honored to be able to share my thoughts about him. He was just an awesome person.
Thanks so much. Oh, sorry, I did it wrong. Craig, thanks so much. So Henry, Brady, can you share your thoughts, please?
Thanks to Michael and David for organizing this too. It's so wonderful to have Gene's family here. People I've known for almost 50 years, and to me was an important part of what made Gene so special. And also wonderful to see so many old friends. As Dotty said, it was a who's who of public policy analysis. As Dean of the Goldman School for 12 years and someone present in the early days of GSPP, I want to talk about Gene's contribution to public policy. Along with Aaron Wildavsky, Arnold Meltzner, Lee Friedman, Bart McGuire, David Kerp, and a group of more senior scholars who really weren't so much with the program, although they were there in the school, Eugene Bardach formed the core of innovators who created the Graduate School of Public Policy, now the Goldman School, in the late 1960s at the University of California at Berkeley. I had the privilege of knowing them when I came to GSPP in 1978. They all contributed important pieces to the architecture of public policy analysis. But more than any of them, Gene defined a field that was then a motley collection of ideas emanating from operations research, political science, cost-benefit analysis, and the successes and failures of the Great Society, which really was a great animating force to public policy analysis in the 70s. Through his critique of these methods, and Aaron Wildavsky, through his critique of these methods and outcomes and through his study of the budgetary process, led the school into the land of public policy. But Eugene Bardach gave the enterprise its shape and form. Gene had a deep and profound notion of how to craft and develop policies that went beyond, as you've already heard from a bunch of people, that went beyond simply critique. It is telling that he spent his entire career within the public policy school, never seeking nor desiring an appointment in political science, which I'm surely he could have gotten. Gene wanted to think about public policy, not political science or policy process. He wanted to think about practical policy outcomes. Starting in the late 1960s, as you already heard, his career spanned the formative period and defined the development of public policy analysis. He wrote pioneering books on program implementation, which you've heard about, coordination across government agencies, skill in policymaking, and of course, 7 editions, I think it's 7, Eric can correct me, of a practical guide for policy analysis. He brought craft, social science knowledge, common sense, and a commitment to his family, which may seem odd, but it seemed to me, as you've already heard, for him, parables and stories and family were an important part of what public policy was about. And he brought all of this to GSBP in a work that really coalesced into deep wisdom about the world. Gene's thinking resembled Talmudic inquiry that is a blend of logical thinking, legal analysis, ethical reflection, and philosophical inquiry. In the case of the Talmud, based upon evidence from a set of texts. For Gene, his texts were written in the way the world and society worked, and he was constantly inquisitive about that text. He brought together the study of this world with logic, evidence, ethics, and philosophy. He demonstrated how public policy analysis went beyond the social science disciplines in which it was rooted in its practicality and its need for wisdom as well as knowledge. In person, his twinkling eyes, rabbinical style, good humor, friendly questioning, times a little tough, and helpful probing reflected his endless curiosity about everything, his deep commitment to fairness and human decency, and his desire, as you already heard, to make the world a better place. Just a month before he passed away, he and I engaged in a back and forth emails about how to think about AI in relationship to his Eightfold Path book, a conversation involving his characteristic questioning and concern about policy analysis. As my colleague for almost 50 years, Gene provided friendship, guidance, support, and a fundamental model for what public policy was all about. Nobody did it better. And I always lived with his voice asking whether I've defined the problem correctly, reviewed the evidence correctly, imagined all the alternatives, developed the right set of criteria for judging policy alternatives, projected the outcomes, and confronted the trade-offs, and ultimately, whether I've told a good story. My story about Eugene Bardach is that he created a field of public policy analysis, and he did so with a deep sense of care and humanity that led to a lifetime of questions followed by answers and then more and deeper questions. He trained a multitude of policy analysts to follow his example and to make the world, indeed, I believe, a better place through their efforts. My thanks to Gene, and I miss him enormously.
Thank you so much, Henry. So one last lineup speaker, Hector Cardenas.
Thank you, Michael. Thank you very much. I came to GSBP in 1994, and it was because of Gene, and not just because of the inspiration and what I had read about him, but also because of a very direct intervention. My acceptance letter to the school had gotten lost. It was sent to Indonesia by mistake instead of Mexico City, and Gene Bardach had picked up my file, I suppose, and thought I was an interesting person to have at GSBP, and so he called my home in Mexico City, and I was on a trip, and so he talked to my dad, and as soon as I got back, my dad said, "I talked to this fantastic guy, amazing person, Eugene Bardach. You really have to go and study with him because he was, we stayed on the phone for 45 minutes and had a chat about all sorts of things, including, history and politics and so forth. This is the person you need to study under." And so, of course, as a good and obedient son, I did exactly what my dad said, and I chose to go to Berkeley, and I chose to study with Gene the whole time. I mean, he was my capstone advisor in the MPP. He was my dissertation advisor. when I did my dissertation, and I see some others who are here on the Bob. It's lovely to see you. He was also on my committee, and David Vogel, with whom I interacted a lot at that time. It's great to see you here, and it was just the beginning of a relationship. I couldn't imagine a better way to start a relationship, an intellectual one, with such an extraordinary mountain of a man that was Gene. And I had, ongoing testaments of his generosity. He invited me into his home, and that's how I met Nancy and Rebecca and Naomi, who was very young at the time. And I remember so many evenings spent around the dinner table at their home, discussing all sorts of things. I mean, we even had sessions where we had rabbinical discussions, and I am a lapsed Catholic, so I was very much out of my depth in these kinds of discussions. But it was always a fantastic opportunity to learn the way that he understood his roots and his culture, and what it brought to the world. And then when he was my dissertation advisor, we would meet very frequently, because one of the things that was characteristic of Gene, and many of you who have spoken before have said this, is his generosity of his time. I mean, with such an extraordinary intellect, so many interests, he could have just been a recluse and just spent all his time working on his own stuff. And instead, he devoted so much time to his students and to his mentees. And it was that really characterized him, the relationship that I had with him as my dissertation advisor. And we would meet frequently, and we would talk certainly about my dissertation, but many times our conversation would veer off topic, and we would speak for sometimes hours. I don't know. Now that I'm a professor, I can't imagine how he would do that, because I have a very hard time, giving just more than a few minutes to each student. But he seemed to have this endless wellspring of time and devotion and interest. And I remember one time I was fairly into my dissertation. It should have been finished by then, and I had a young daughter who was a baby still, and we would always talk about that, because, as we've already heard, Gene was a family man through and through, and he really cared about family. And so he would always ask me about my baby, until one day he said, "Hector," I think he said, like Craig said, "Hector, Hector, Hector, you need to stop playing with your baby and finish your dissertation." And that was another great gift that he gave me, because I did. And I went on to pursue a career in public policy implementation, exactly the things that Gene was known for. And in all of the work that I've done over the past 25 years, I've tried to be faithful to the ideas that Gene has brought forward. So I think when many of his students, we remember Gene Bardach, we always begin with the Eightfold Path. And that's understandable, because it's probably the single most influential book on public policy analysis of the last 40 or 50 years. And generations of students around the world have learned to define problems, to assemble evidence, et cetera, and tell the story of a policy recommendation through Gene's remarkably practical framework. But I think if we remember only the Eightfold Path, we will have missed Gene's greatest contribution. Because Gene didn't just teach a method, he taught a way of thinking. More than that, he taught a professional ethic, a discipline of mind, an understanding of public policy as a craft. I've often thought that the best word to describe Gene's approach is craftsmanship. We've heard here architecture. I think craftsmanship is even a better encapsulation of what he stood for. Not art, not science, but craftsmanship. Because a craftsman works with rigor, but also with humility. A craftsman knows that perfection is unattainable, that every piece can be improved, that the materials impose constraints, and that reality is always more complex than our first attempt to understand it. So the craftsman observes carefully, measures, compares, experiments, revises, and begins again, over and over. And that was Gene's vision of policy analysis. That's what you got from him when you spoke to him. You got endless questions, right? Refashioning, rethinking all of our assumptions. His Eightfold Path, I think, has often been misunderstood as a linear checklist. First define the problem, then gather evidence, then identify alternatives. But Gene never practiced policy analysis that way. The steps were never meant to be a staircase. They were folds in a continuous conversation. You define a problem only to discover through evidence that you misunderstood it. You develop alternatives and suddenly realize there are stakeholders you had overlooked. You choose evaluation criteria, and they force you to rethink what success really means. Good policy analysis is not moving in a straight line. It's a deliberate iteration, a continuous dialogue between evidence, values, alternatives, and consequences. That lesson that Gene taught us seems to me even more important today than when Gene first taught it. We live in an era of instant opinions and absolute certainty. Public debate is often dominated by people who believe either that data alone gives them all the answers, or by those who dismiss evidence whenever it challenges their convictions. Gene rejected both forms of arrogance. He believed that rigor and humility were not opposites, they were partners. His scholarship, as we've heard today, extended far beyond policy analysis itself. Long before today's debates about regulatory reform and the abundance agenda, Gene was studying how regulatory systems become irrational over time. He understood that regulations are usually created for good reasons, but that they accumulate like layers of sediment. Rules designed to solve yesterday's problems begin to obstruct today's solutions. Organizations created to solve problems gradually devote more energy to administering their own procedures than to achieving public purposes. His critique was never ideological. It came from a deeply pragmatic concern with making government more effective. And Gene understood something else that governments still struggle to learn. Policies rarely fail in legislation or in speeches. They fail in implementation. They fail in the last mile when incentives are poorly aligned, where administrative capacity is weak, or when the complexity of real life overwhelms the assumptions made by policy designers. His work on implementation reminded us that success depends not only on having good ideas, but on faithfully translating these ideas into action. Finally, Gene taught us something that many policy schools still do not emphasize enough. He taught us that good analysts must also be good storytellers. And the snippets of fantastic writing that Bob Kagan read at the beginning are just a testament to that care and craft that Gene displayed in his writing. And he tried to make us, do the same thing in our work as students. Not because stories replace evidence, but because evidence without narrative rarely persuades. Stories can help citizens and decision makers understand complexity. They can help to connect data to human experience and deliberate honestly about difficult trade-offs. For Gene, storytelling was not an alternative to analysis. It was an essential part of analysis. I just want to conclude by saying that for those of us who had the privilege of learning from him and knowing him, his influence extended well beyond his books. He modeled intellectual generosity. He challenged our assumptions without dismissing us. He demanded precision without encouraging arrogance. He made us better analysts, but he also tried to make us wiser practitioners. In the end, Gene's legacy is not simply a collection of analytical tools. It's a vision of what it means to serve the public well. Rigor without arrogance, ambition without grandiosity, pragmatism without cynicism, and above all, humility. The humility to recognize that our models are incomplete, that our solutions create new problems, and that we always have more to learn. I think that if we really want to honor Eugene Bardach, we should certainly continue teaching what he taught. We have to teach the Eightfold Path, yes, but the greater tribute would be to practice the craft as he practiced it, with curiosity, discipline, generosity, and the quiet determination to improve public policy, one careful piece at a time. We are going to miss you, Eugene, because we really need you at this time. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Hector. That's the Gene we know for sure. Thank you for that craftsmanship. I'm going to try to share now a video that was put together by someone who couldn't join us because of a conflict from outside Berkeley, and even outside the United States. Juan Subirats, whose book is here. And I'll just see if my computer works. So,
my name is Joan Subirats. I am a professor of public policy at the Autonomous University of Barcelona. It's hard to overstate what Eugene Bardach mean to our field. For me, there are only a handful of scholars who truly shaped the discipline of policy analysis from the ground up. Charles Lindblom, Aaron Bildavsky, Gian Domenico Maione, and very few others. Bardach belongs without question in that company. Together with Bildavsky, he helped turn the Goldman School of Public Policy at Berkeley into one of the great homes of policy thinking anywhere in the world. And he did it not by founding a doctrine, but by teaching people how to think. That, I believe, was his genius. Bardach was, above all, a teacher. He understood that policy analysis is not a body of fixed answers, but a discipline of intelligent questioning, defining the problem well and gathering the evidence honestly, analyzing the alternatives without illusion. His book, A Practical Guide for Policy Analysis, what he called the Eightfold Path, has trained generations of analysts on every continent. It is one of those rare works that is both deeply intelligent and genuinely useful. Few academics ever write a book that the students kept on their desk for the rest of their careers. Jen wrote exactly that. What made him remarkable was that his rigor was never cold. He cared about whether government actually works for ordinary people. I had the privilege of knowing this side of him personally. Many years ago, I invited Jean to Catalonia, where together with Michael Barcela and Mark Moore, he led several days of intensive training for the most senior public managers in our country, in Catalonia. It was a remarkable gathering, three of the finest minds in public management working directly with people responsible for real decisions affecting real lives. What our directors took from those days was not a set of techniques only, but a way of thinking. That was, I think, Bardach's gift. He returned the invitation in his own way. He welcomed me to the Public Policy Center at Berkeley, and more memorably, he opened his home to me. I will always remember that hospitality, the warmth, the generosity, the conversations that move easily between politics, history, and ideas. The combination of intellectual seriousness and human warmth, it is what made him not only a great scholar, but a great mentor and a truly friend. So today I want to remember Eugene Bardach as the towering figure who helped invent a discipline and the generous man who shared his time with a colleague from Barcelona. So many of us across countries, across generations, learned to ask better questions because of him. Jean, thank you for the books, for the teaching, for the friendship, and for reminding all of us why this work matters. You will be deeply missed.
So I want to share with you a picture of the occasion which was mentioned by Juan Subirats from 1993 or so.
Mhm.
And well, age has changed some of us, but not everybody. So I think Gene can take a little bit of credit for the development of the Masters in Public Management program at the Autonomous University of Barcelona, which is now in its about 30th year. Um, right. So I have a few things to say. If you don't mind, I won't take up a lot of time because so much has already been said. But I guess the general thing is everything that's said about what Gene is represents for people. I think many of us have tried to live through our own academic lives. I think down to every value that has been stated so far. I wouldn't say that Gene is the cause of it, but he's certainly a standard that all of us have in mind all the time. I would also underscore the generosity of his time point. I've never had any problem getting through to him and talking to him. I think my first encounter was on the telephone, actually. I was at the Kennedy School, and I think I was doing cases for the Innovations in State and Local Government program. I don't know what case I was working on, but he asked me a few questions about it and a few more questions, and pretty soon I felt out of my depth. Um, uh, and then he kept on going, and then had another thought about what he had said, and another thought about the two thoughts that he had said, and another about the three thoughts, and then as it accumulated, and I just at some point said, I haven't met anybody like that at the Kennedy School, at least yet. And I thought maybe this field of public management's more interesting than I had begun to come to believe. You know, if somebody can be that thoughtful and intelligent about cases, not just sort of borrowing from their sheer intelligence, but borrowing on something that I couldn't quite fathom, then maybe I'd stick around and try to figure it out. I'll also mention a few important things career-wise. Back in 1993, a certain Larry Lynn decided that he was going to do a lot of trash talking about public management in print. He called it bomb throwing, but we can call it what it was. And wrote well, I would say a scathing account of public management as it had developed, according to him, to that point, mainly taking aim at the innovations program, the Kennedy School, Bob Bain more than others, but I got thrown into the mix. And Gene wrote a comment. Had an invited comment on this and wanted to clarify some things and put down a few markers against Lynn's argument. And he wrote a piece called the problem of best practice research, which I think in some ways was the first indication of a line of thinking he would engage in for forever thus. And he used my Breaking Through Bureaucracy book as his case in point, illustrating his developing understanding of how we ought to be talking about practice. And I learned so much from that piece. I mean, I could barely recognize the book, but it sounded like a very good piece of analysis, even if it wasn't mine. And from that point forward, I decided I was going to try to really understand the mechanism and the machine behind the development of those remarks. He was also, I think, behind my getting invited to be the third Wildavsky speaker on the public policy forum at Berkeley, and that set me on a path of doing some work in more like a political science realm that has been very important. But I think the main importance has been his further work on something alternative to best practice. He eventually, I think, settled on smart practice analysis as a term. It was in the craft, the agencies getting to get working together book. It's in the Eightfold Path, and more or less in those terms. And I had the opportunity to hear him voice it all out from I think one of the first incarnations. Perhaps the first version was in that very room Nancy's sitting in, or at least one that I remember looking quite like it, and going on and on about his ideas about design and things that worked, and a little bit of architecture, and said he'd been reading mechanical engineering texts, which were fascinating. And but he's learned more about this from Nancy than perhaps anyone else. And I said, well, that sounds like a very productive direction. And struggled to get a lot of people interested in it. I remember him giving an invited keynote address at an international public management network conference some years better, and Fred may remember this. And afterwards, people said, "What was that?" There was but in any case, eventually it all, I think, came together in magnificent form in his APAM presidential address of 2003, published a year later, called The Extrapolation Problem, learning from others. And there was a beautiful idea in there. And the idea, it was essentially that if you wanted to look at practices that work, you can do it for practices that fail, but for practices that work, you don't want to rely on a superficial account of how good outcomes eventuated from what was present or occurring in a program. Superficial account would, no, it'd be a story, but you would have many elements related to each other, and they come together in the narrative account. You want to theorize it essentially, and the concept he brought in for theorizing was mechanisms in a general sense, not in every sense that people use the term today. And he accounted for the success of the Berkeley 2-week spring exercise using a couple of mechanism concepts, in particular psychological arousal was one of them. And this idea, which I think I hadn't seen before, was developed into a further metaphor about craft or design. And it sort of traded on the notion that engineers understand physical nature. They want to make the world better in some respect, or meet needs in one respect or another. And they regarded engineering as making, and this is a classic thing, but making physical natures, free gifts available for the ingenious person to put together, or to accomplish something socially, something for people. Okay, so nature's free gifts from physical nature, creating something that could take advantage of those free gifts to get a good result on the cheap. Okay, and he said that's fine for machines and whatever, but we can have an analogous idea. And the analogous idea is that social nature is made up by social and psychological mechanisms. They're just out there waiting to be taken advantage of by the ingenious policy or managerial craftsperson or designer. And so public management or policy analysis is about taking social nature's free gifts and putting them at the service of satisfying human wants. And I think that's an advance on some of the other ideas he's had, and one that we should take with us. So I don't know, Nancy, thank you for helping him get that idea on his mind. I started putting this into my research as early as a book on the U.S. Air Force and how it was that they were able to do some planning, and it's become an obsession over the last 25 years. And I've tried to articulate a whole, all the ideas you'd need to understand that idea and make it part of research and teaching. Okay. Gene wasn't too interested in this project, I think, because He didn't need all the context. He didn't need these ideas spelled out in the abstract as a form of inquiry because he didn't get there that way and he didn't need it. But I felt that
You want me out there now, or you want to wait a couple more minutes? You okay? Wait another 5 minutes?
the field needs it. Sorry, the field needs it. And I'm glad to have put in words, I think, what he was looking for us, looking for everybody to understand. I look forward to sharing that with all of you. But I'll share you one last thing about teaching, because his ideas about teaching have infused my teaching for 20 years. And I would say, oh, first of all, I teach that piece, the APAM presidential address, and my students would come back after being out for a little while and say they reread that piece every 6 months. That's how powerful it is. And I would teach cases in a way that I thought was appropriate. And one student came up afterwards at the end and said, well, in most courses, the question they ask is, what would you do with cases? And I learned from this course that that's not really the question to ask. The question was, what could work? And I think that is one of the signature questions that Gene represented and presented to us. So I think his thoughts will live on through all of our work and for successive generations. So those are my comments, and that's the end of all of the presentations. So we're now open to comments. A few people have mentioned that they wanted to speak up now or soon after, and we have a list of 3. Ira Shapiro is on the list. I'll just go through these 3 names, and then it'll just be open for putting up your hand. So thank you. Ira?
Yes, I'm Ira Shapiro, and I realized that I've actually knew Gene longer than anyone except Nancy. I was 19 years old and a sophomore at Brandeis University with a vague interest in politics, and I met a young professor who basically changed my career course. Gene was just starting as a teacher. He was a wonderful teacher. This was Politics 21A, political science, politics, political parties, political behavior. And we became friends, and he became my mentor. 2 years after we met, two classmates and I went to Gene and said, we'd like to write a joint honors thesis on the George Wallace political campaign. He was running for president. Nobody ever wrote a joint honors undergraduate thesis. Gene was delighted with the idea. He sponsored it. He found us money to travel with the Wallace campaign. When I got a job, Senate internship later, Gene found me money so my new wife and I could afford to live in Washington. Gene also helped me get a fellowship to Berkeley, which was a very 5-year special career fellowship. And because of his generosity of spirit, Gene forgave me when I thought that academia was not my way. And I decided to go to law school and try to go to Washington to work in government. But years afterward, when I circled back to write several books, Gene was always delighted that I actually wrote books. And more recently, last year, he read something that I had written on Substack, in which I said, after 70 days of Trump's presidency, seen enough, impeach and remove. And Gene was delighted with that, and he sent me his second Declaration of Independence. And we got to talking about the situation, and I told him we were putting together a group of people to do an anti-Trump book, which turned out to be a comprehensive damage assessment of the first 16 months of Trump. And Gene joined in with our group. He was on every conference call we had. He contributed his wisdom and his humor and the notion that the idea that we were risking the future of the country. His contribution was so significant that when the book came out, Betrayed, America Didn't Vote for This, we dedicated it to Gene, who had passed just a couple of weeks before. And I wrote, a brilliant scholar and a wonderful teacher, Gene brought his characteristic wisdom, passion, principles, and humor to our work. So I knew him first and worked with him last. And he had an enormous impact on me, although I was not in touch with him as often as his regular colleagues at Goldman and other public policy people. Nancy, Rebecca, Naomi, thank you for everything. And thanks for letting me say a few words.
Of course. Eric, Deborah?
I'm going to put on my APAM cap. I'm only going to talk about APAM. Of course, Gene was deeply associated with APAM from its start in 1979. He was the president who organized the 2002 conference in Dallas. He was the only person who enjoyed the 2002 conference in Dallas because we were all trapped in a hotel with no way out, and he loved the fact that everybody was trapped and had to go to sessions and actually engage for once. He absolutely loved that. Nobody else did, but God bless Gene for that. I asked him what he wanted to do with his presidency. He said, I want to work on how we assign conference sessions to rooms. I looked at him like, really? And he backed her off and said, pretty dumb, huh? I said, yeah, let's do something else. So he pivoted from climbing the foothills around Berkeley to Mount Everest. He redid the publishing contract for JPAM with John Wiley and Sons, a topic you could not have paid any president of APAM ever to touch with a 10-foot pole. And we went in there with me gasping behind him, and he played poker with John Wiley and Sons. We had no cards, none. He convinced them we had 4 aces and they folded. And the entire structure of the previous contract, which was horrid to APAM, was wiped off the face of the earth and was completely redone with tremendous benefit to the association, completely on a bluff. I was just gasping behind him, terrified. And he was like, we got this. He taught me, as I put in one of the remarks I submitted online, never fight over symbols, Eric, only fight over money. And the last thing I'll point out that he taught me just personally was, as far as I know, he became emeritus when he turned 65. And I asked him why. He said, Eric, you get to a certain point, you got to start looking at the people behind you on the road while you're driving. If there's hundreds of cars stuck on the road behind you, you need to get off the road and let these younger people go where they're going. And that's why I'm getting off the road, so that younger people can get where they need to go. And I've actually made that a premise of my professional career. I've shocked a lot of people saying, I'm going to retire when I can and get out of the way and let other people younger than me have their shot. And I was inspired to do that by Gene. Thank you for this opportunity, and bless all of you who had these amazing remarks to say. Really appreciated them. And just on behalf of APAM, he was a terrific president, and the community, of course, will deeply miss him forever.
Thank you so much. Xavier, you could also mention what Subirats was saying.
Yes, I hope that you can hear me well. I'm in Montreal in a summer school on the management of creativity, and I took the time to attend this wonderful gathering that I'm so grateful that Michael mentioned it to me. Actually, I'm Xavier Castañer. I'm originally from Barcelona. I'm Catalan, and as a matter of fact, I met Michael and Mark Moore at the same time that Eugene, but I spent much more time with Michael and Mark. I don't know why. I was starting my career. I was very young. I think I was 23 years old in 1993, starting as a research assistant at the SADE, at this program that Joan Subirats was mentioning in his video. Joan was actually most recently Minister for Universities and Science in Spain. He's responsible for the most recent law of universities in Spain. And indeed, I was in that program. But I wanted to tell you actually that as the current chair of the Advisory Council of IFSAM and a former president of IFSAM. IFSAM is the International Federation of Scholarly Associations of Management, which was founded 36 years ago with the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. And by 12 scholarly associations around the world. And actually today, it has 29 associations across the 5 continents, representing about 25,000 colleagues in the broadly defined field, multidisciplinary field of management, which should be much more interdisciplinary, as Michael and others have been trying to do. And as a matter of fact, there are several colleagues in the Federation who are in the field of public management. President-elect Rachel Ashworth, a professor at Cardiff, is a professor of public management, and Alqueta Pecci, who is the former president of the Brazilian Academy of Management and current interim dean of the Getulio Vargas School of Management. She's also in the field of public management. So I think I just wanted to say how much I learned through this gathering, how moving it has been, and how important, as it has been said, Eugene Bardach contributions with the implementation game in strategy process literature, in the whole, I would say, change literature, right, has been in the broader field of management, but also in agencies, through agencies working together in the field of interorganizational alliances and relations and cooperation. And there, I think, much more potential for his work and others' work to actually inform the research that we do and the education in the broad field of management. And I think we would be delighted at IFSAM if the public management associations and the public administration associations, scholarly associations, join the Federation in a time, as you know, so momentous and so, I would say, dramatic, in which AI and geopolitics are deeply affecting higher education and the science field in all disciplines. So thank you so much, Michael, and it's been a pleasure and an honor.
Thank you, Xavier. Well, we have a few minutes left. If we're going to go to the top of the hour, 25 minutes or so, it's open mic is the concept. I don't feel I need to, you have to put up your hand or anything. Just jump right in. If that doesn't work, we can try something else. Yeah, I can cold call on a few people.
Can I say words?
Yes, please.
My name is Soren Winter. I'm from Denmark, and I was visiting Berkeley in 1993. I met Gene at an international conference and told him about my interest in visiting Berkeley. That was certainly the place to go if you wanted to learn something about implementation, which was my new interest. And Gene provided an invitation for me to go to the public policy school, as it was called at that time. And he even let me borrow his office while he was on sabbatical at home. He also lent me his car for taking a Californian driver's license, which was necessary. And he cut through all the bureaucracy by just let me use his car for that occasion. He invited me and my family to his home with Nancy, and we were visiting even for Hanukkah. It was wonderful visiting them at home. I'll never forget that. And I also enjoyed walking around in the Berkeley Hills with Gene in the morning, sometimes with Bob Kagan attending too. And it was wonderful discussions in the sunny streets of Berkeley. Some years later, Jean and Nancy even let me use their house for vacation while they were traveling themselves. And I remember many occasions with Jean and Nancy, and also some of the children, including Nancy, including Naomi. So I'm very grateful. There's been so much talk about Jean's academic achievements, but I wanted to focus on his hospitality and generosity. So thank you very much. I'm very grateful to Jean, and thank you also very much, Nancy.
Excuse me. This is about the beginnings and the ends. I met Gene in 1957, so I may be his oldest acquaintance on this call. I'm not sure. We were freshmen at Columbia, and we developed a friendship. And at this point, he was like all of us at that age in formation, but we just liked each other from the very beginning. And we've stayed friends all these years. And we had the honor of being house guests, Phyllis and I, of the Bardachs on the week that he died. And I can tell you that he was continuously engaged, and he was really excited about the work that he was doing that week. And we were, of course, like all of you who had the hospitality of the Bardachs, overwhelmed by the friendship and engagement. But I was struck at how deeply he was engaged in new amendments to a new edition of the Eightfold Path. And Eric has mentioned in passing that he's gotten a lot of notes from Gene. And this is a challenge then that he has one more gift to give us, which will be managed, I presume, through Eric's efforts. It is a measure of him that he was so engaged and so excited about the new things that he was working on. And so I'm hoping that all of us will have the opportunity to have this one more gift. Thank you.
I'd like to add something. We were going to California, so we called to say to Jean and Nancy, we'd like to see you while we're there. And Jean immediately said, oh, well, then you'll stay with us, won't you? That's the first thing I wanted to say about his wonderful hospitality. The second thing is I wanted to say the love that I saw in that house, the way that Nancy took care of Jean, the way that she made sure that he got out for his walks. It was just terrific. And the way that Jean loved his house, and the way that his kids had stepped in and made it possible for him to stay there with the wonderful the chairs that would go up the different level of stairs. And there's just such sweetness and love, and I feel so blessed that I got to know him as well. Thank you.
Ben, do you have anything to share? I know you communicated with me a little bit beforehand.
Oh, well, it's just I'm just I'm delighted to be here and to hear so many of these memories. You know, I think they resonate with me very deeply, and of course we've heard various references to, you know, Gene's. I think it was Henry who mentioned his Talmudic style, and of course he was a deeply engaged, proud Jew and Zionist with very unpredictable opinions, as has been discussed. And I just would say personally, you know, he was just a cherished figure in my life. As some of you know, I wrote a little something for his 85th birthday last year. Actually, I gave him a little video tribute in which I mentioned as a 5 or 6 year old in Berkeley, Gene would drive me and Elizabeth, who I think is still on the call, to Hebrew school. And the big excitement for me as a 5 or 6 year old was he would let me put my hand on the gear shift to help him shift gears. And I've always remembered that. But of course, as an adult, I became interested, among other things, in some of the same, sort of Torah study that he has done and which he was so steeped in. So I would send him a couple of things I'd written for little Divrei Torah, commentaries on the Torah, and he would give me great feedback, very much, unvarnished, and supportive and critical, depending on the case. And I said to him, it was like his hand was still there guiding mine all these years later. And so, of course, I'll miss him as we all will. And I think these were just wonderful tributes. So thank you so much to everyone who organized this.
Lee Friedman, you were mentioned so many times in the comments. Maybe you have a thought for us.
Hi, everybody. I loved all your comments. As I think pretty much all of you know that Gene and I have been colleagues at the Goldman School for over 50 years. And I was thinking about what would Gene think about all of this if he were listening to it. And I know that he would sort of like poo-poo or wave his hand about the personal tributes to him. He didn't care about that. But what he would care about and what he would love and would just have made him be very joyful was to see all the creativity and all the thoughtfulness about the same kinds of things that he thought about in all of you, and seeing all of that going forward. That would make him be very, very happy. And it makes me happy too for him. Thank you.
Super. Some people don't have their cameras on, but I might ask Fred Thompson if he has anything to share. Are you there, Fred?
Yes, I am. Thank you. Let me just say one thing, and that is that more than anything else, my interaction were devoted to talking about Victorian literature. It turned out that we both had a fascination with Trollope, and he insisted that basically Trollope's novels were illustrations of his basic ideas about the use of the skill factor in politics. And we mostly talked about novels. The amazing thing is that he had to be one of the broadest, most open individuals I have known in my academic and practical career. That's about all.
Thanks, Fred. David Vogel, any thoughts to share? If you'd have to unmute yourself to share them. You need to unmute. There you go.
I'll leave it to others who knew Gene much better. But I do recall my interaction with him the whole 50 years I was on the Berkeley faculty, and I valued his research, and it's a big loss.
Okay, thank you very much. This is a good moment for anybody to, even for short comments, to chime in and before we wrap up.
This is Bill Zumeta from the University of Washington. I remember Fred mentioned the skill factor in politics, I had quite a privilege of spending many hours in a car with Gene. He was driving, and he asked me to read the dissertation, next to final version of his dissertation, which was the Skill Factor manuscript, and to critique it and to help him edit it while he was driving. I was taking notes and writing on the manuscript. These were the old days, and we were driving from Boston, where I was a graduate student of his in the politics department at Brandeis, and he. So I got a sense of, and so as I would make comments, uh, he would react to those, and so I got a sense of how he was thinking about things. And as a junior would-be scholar, to see him early in his career, just getting his dissertation finished and thinking about his teaching and all of that, it was a great privilege to see how he thought about things, how he behaved, and so on. And of course, I saw that his intellect was unusual, and his Hector Cardenas put it as talked about craftsmanship. His this was later reflected, of course, in his writing, but I got to hear it in the classroom uh, about how he thought about things like political entrepreneurship or policy entrepreneurship, we'd now say, about the beginnings of the ideas in the implementation game, the beginnings of the Eightfold Path ideas that were emerging at that early in his career. And so he convinced me to leave. It wasn't hard to do, to leave political science at Brandeis and move to Berkeley with him. He had, together with Aaron Wildavsky, helped arrange for my transfer, or whatever you want to call it, admission to the program at Berkeley. I ended up getting one of the early PhDs out of the school, and taught policy implementation for a number of years. Used his books all the way through, including the book about regulation that Bob Kagan talked about, and just he influenced my thinking forever. Uh, it, it, uh, it was a wonderful experience just to see the early part of his career and how he taught, how he interacted with students, how his ideas emerged, how they be turned into written work. So he really had a formative impact on me as a scholar, and of course he was a wonderful guy, and as everybody has said, a tremendous influence on the people he interacted with. So I'm glad we're doing this. I thank Michael and all the people that spoken. I thank Eric Patashnik in particular for taking on the work of updating or continuing to work on as Gene would say, continuing to work on the Eightfold Path book. It's been a huge influence. I've used it in my teaching for all these years. So I can't think of a bigger influence on my career than Gene. Thanks, Gene.
This is Rebecca. I'm his middle daughter. And it's very moving to hear whatever he says. It's funny because he was, it's in many ways, he was clearly a sort of a father figure in a lot of ways and a teacher for, not just me, but for so many people in so many different ways. And he, I'm just very struck by sort of so many points. And I'm so sorry that so many of the things that I've been working on over these years that he will not be part of my continued conversations about things and about the work that I'm trying to do here in Jerusalem, here in Israel. But one of the things that strikes me is the talk about implementation, because I came at everything more from the world of practice as a practitioner, be it Bosnia and Hungary, working with Bosnian refugees, and then moving to Israel and being here for many years, working with issues both here and internationally. And so many of the things that I understood were around implementation challenges, and that there's ideology and there's policy and there's theory. But at the end of the day, so much of it is about really the day-to-day nitty-gritty of implementation. And I'm just sorry that as I continue to do what I can here with all the things that matter, that he's not here to be my thought partner and consultant about stuff. So
Thank you so much. So any other Bardachs would like to make some comments before we close out? Is Naomi here or had to leave?
I think Naomi had to leave. She was on her way to another event. This is Nancy Bardach. I thought it was, of course, a marvelous thing to hear how Gene provided friendship and love and influence on all these people's careers and work and thinking and policy. And I learned a fair amount from it all. And among other things, I learned to admire him even more than I do personally. And it's just marvelous to hear about the academic side. This is sort of like a Festschrift where we're talking about how he changed the world in a way. And I do appreciate knowing that very much. Thank you all.
Thanks to you. So let's wrap it up on that note. Some of you, when you registered, wrote remembrances, and we're going to collect those and make them available to everybody here, for starters. I don't know if you could probably still re-register if you didn't put one in, and we'll catch that. So we'll wait a couple days before pulling it together. David mentioned that this is recorded and will be uploaded to the YouTube site that he manages, and I'll make sure that you receive the link for that. And well, this has been amazing. We've had at peak 100 people on the call. I also learned a lot, and of course, I think Gene would be happy that we were all together and closer for that experience. David, thanks for hosting. If you have any comments you want to share, having heard all of this now.
Thank you all for participating. I learned a lot as well. And we'll send you a note with the video. Take care and have peace. Bye-bye.
Thanks, everybody.